Alright, so this is part 2 of chapter 6, although my PowerPoint actually kind of goes not necessarily in the same order as the chapter, because I pulled this from some of my civics materials that I teach, or my political science materials that I teach, because I feel like the book kind of just flies through this, and I want to go in a little more in depth with it. So, here we see just some of the organizing principles or ideals of government. Talks about that a little bit. You can see a quote from John Adams about how really the American Revolution was a revolution in thought as much as it was a revolution in action. The idea that these ideals really were going to come to fruition in the form of a new type of government. You know, it's easy to say that in 1818 after the fact, right? But was that really true is kind of what we're going to be assessing on the discussion board as well. So just kind of keep that thought in mind, and really all of these different ideas in mind as you can prepare for that discussion board, because that's really going to be key to all of this. The actual Constitutional Convention included 55 delegates. They assembled in Philadelphia to revise the Articles. They looked at different models of government, found none were really ideal. The confederacies, like the Articles of Confederation, were simply too weak to effectively govern. Stronger forms of government is exactly what they feared. They had just left the monarchy. They didn't want to go back to that. And so they were trying to find, kind of like the Goldilocks solution, right? Not too hot, not too cold. So they drew on state constitutions and started to come up with something new altogether, which is not necessarily what they went there for to begin with. In fact, there's a lot of questions over the legality of what they did, and there's not really even questions because it was illegal. There was nothing, within the bounds of the Articles that said they could do what they were about to do. In fact, there's a new book out, published within the last year called The Founders' Coup. This really was a coup. It was an overthrowing of an established government by the Founding Fathers when they create the Constitution. So the question they really had to deal with was how to devise a government that was strong enough to preserve order, but not so strong that it would threaten liberty. And James Madison is going to be central to a lot of the writings that take place of the Constitution. He's known as the father of the Constitution, fairly or unfairly. There was a lot of other important thinkers that play a role, but he definitely plays a significant role in the creation of our government. So James Madison is a guy you need to keep an eye on in this process. The initial vote on June 19th, 7 states prefer what was called the Virginia Plan. The Virginia Plan essentially called for a 2-house legislature, where representation on Congress is based on population in both houses. Obviously, that favors the larger states, though, and the smaller states aren't real happy. So they come up with a counter, the New Jersey Plan. It's essentially kind of like what they have now. To kind of hammer out the differences between the two, we end up with what's called the Great Compromise, and that gives us the form of government we have today. And you can review the details on all of that through their textbook or through these PowerPoints or through tons of other resources. All this information's out there. None of this is like top secret stuff. The Great Compromise barely passes, by the way, 5-4. So we almost don't have a government. It almost falls apart before it really even starts. And that's something to kind of keep in mind, right, is the historical perspective. That even though all of this today seems inevitable when it occurs, it's certainly far from that. No one really knows how any of this is going to turn out as the negotiations are in process. There's a lot of other compromises that emerge, too, in the process of the creation of the Constitution. It's how we get the Electoral College, for instance. Some folks want Congress to choose the president. Others want the people to directly elect the president. The compromise is you have some mediating body, the Electoral College, that is kind of a go-between the people and the election of the president itself. So that's why we have that. I would call it the mess that we have today. I'm not a big fan, but historically I understand why it was there. I'm not sure it's still necessary, but that's something you guys can think about and decide for yourselves. How long would the president serve was another big question, right? Some wanted a life term, some a single 7-year term. The 4-year term became the compromise solution again, with no limits on how many times he could be reelected. It's not constitutional when it's originally written. It's not until after FDR challenges the precedent of the 2-term presidency in the 20th century that they add an amendment to make it a term-limited presidency. And then House Supreme Court justices were going to be chosen, another big issue. The compromise is that it's appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, so that 2 branches of government are affected by creating that 3rd branch of government, members of that 3rd branch of government. The 3/5 compromise is another major compromise. And the issue of slavery in the Constitution is another major issue about which texts have been written. And if it's something that you're interested in, you can certainly dig deeper into that topic more than we can here. The 3/5 compromise, though, essentially says that 3/5 of the slaves would count toward the population of a state. And obviously why that matters is if representation in the House of Representatives is based on population, then Virginia is arguing, well, a lot of our population is slaves, so they should count toward the representation too. The North says, wait a minute, why are you guys counting them as population when you claim their property? And so this is the compromise that emerges out of this, essentially acknowledging slaves as 3/5 of a person. By all practical sense. The word slave, by the way, is not specifically mentioned in the Constitution, nor is slavery or the slave trade. They are all referred to euphemistically. They're never actually directly referenced, and that was absolutely deliberate by the founders. They were just uncomfortable dealing with this issue, talking about this issue. They just wanted it to go away. Many thought that it would just die out on its own as time went on instead of strengthen, which obviously it did, leading to civil war. It was just something that was never really dealt with properly. So ultimately you create what's called a republic, which is a type of democracy in which the system of representation operates, where we elect people to go speak for us. It's democratic in the sense that the government is based on popular consent, that the people have a voice. So you hear both of these terms used. People say, oh, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. Well, we're a democratic republic, we're a Republican government, however you want to word it. Representative democracy, these terms can be used fairly interchangeably. I don't get too caught up in the details of those terms. Some people do. But lots of different kind of details here. And again, it's far from perfect, right? As it's born with slavery as part of it, though. And that's something that's going to be with us for the rest of this class, is how do we deal with that underlying paradox of a nation that's all about freedom and the people having a voice, and yet we hold people as slaves. There's not an easy answer, by the way. So then, once the Constitution's created and it's approved by all the folks in Philadelphia, then it goes out to the states, and each state has to ratify it too, or enough states have to ratify it for it to go into effect or approve of it. This sets up the great debate between what became known as the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. Federalists were people who supported the Constitution. Anti-Federalists were those who were opposed to it in its current form. The Anti-Federalist felt like the Constitution created a central government that was too strong, too powerful, was going to take away rights, was going to tax, was going to lead to a standing army. A lot of that stuff ended up being true, and yet still it's the central government that has protected a lot of rights in the long run too, in a number of different situations. The Federalists, on the other hand, did support ratification. They're led by James Madison, writes the Constitution, and another man named Alexander Hamilton, who we haven't talked too much about yet, but we will, especially as we talk about the creation of the new government. But Hamilton and Madison together write what's called the Federalist Papers. And it's a series of essays really explaining in detail the thinking behind our system of government, how it's set up and how it's created. And those essays that defend the Constitution are really persuasive, and they're ultimately what probably leads to ratification and approval of this. So you can see the votes at the district level for and opposed to ratification. It really just depended on kind of where you were. You can see the more rural areas were against ratification. More developed areas were in favor in general, but there were some even divides too in the frontier areas. So the ratification vote was very close in a number of states. Ultimately, Virginia, you can see it's within 10 votes. New York was another one where it was very close. Hamilton's finally able to push it through, even though the governor of New York, George Clinton, was very much opposed to it. You can see Massachusetts also fairly close, right? So the biggest states as far as population were the ones that were really resistant on this. Delaware, we become the first state because we love it. We add it right away, 30-0. December 7th. We're a small state. We can't really stand on our own. We don't have any Western claims, and so we have no problem being part of this larger government. We'd only been independent from Pennsylvania for about 20 years, so we were really totally okay with kind of jumping back into this larger government. We'd had that experience before, and we were okay with it. Same with some of the other smaller states, New Jersey, for instance, too. Rhode Island, much more divided for a number of reasons. They were not really in favor of the whole process. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, obviously that's an important part of our Constitution today, but it's not part of the original. It was an agreement. The Anti-Federalists really wanted it. The Federalists said, look, we'll do it, but it's going to come afterwards. Let's approve what we have first, but we will work on this, we promise. And it's actually James Madison that writes these and proposes them before Congress, and they get pushed through pretty quick. He actually writes 12, only 10 make it through, but close enough. So one of the big questions then that comes up with the Constitution is, well, what about constitutional equality? Well, it doesn't really do it. I mean, there's not equality. There's the 3/5 compromise. There's also a fugitive slave clause that says that fugitives have to be returned. There's also something that preserves the slave trade with Africa for 20 years. Although after that 20-year period, to the credit of the founders or the people that were in power at the time, they do say, all right, no more slaves from Africa. But it doesn't end slavery at all either. So William Lloyd Garrison, who's an abolitionist, eventually calls the Constitution a covenant with death and an agreement with hell because of the slavery aspect of it. But the reality is the Constitution would not have existed without slavery. The South only approved it because slavery was not really mentioned in detail, and because their institutions and their quote-unquote peculiar way of life was preserved, and their property rights as they viewed it were protected. And it's hard for us, I think, today to put ourselves in that mind frame. But even Ben Franklin, who by this time was anti-slavery, he owned slaves when he was younger, but was very anti-slavery by this point in his life, understood that this was not the time to deal with that issue, that we needed a government first and a stable country first. And really, I think the folks in this generation punted. They said, all right, we're going to kick this can down the road. We're going to deal with this a little later once our country's stable, once our government's stable. Once we're strong enough to deal with the slavery issue, we'll deal with it. Of course, the problem being then is that when it's time to finally deal with it, we can't. And our nation almost falls apart as a result of it, really because this generation doesn't deal with it when they should have. Women aren't mentioned or addressed in the Constitution at all either. So that's also worth noting. This is a Constitution that's for men by men, and women aren't afforded any real rights in it at all. And it takes a while before they're incorporated into it. That said, by the standards of the time, the Constitution, the process of ratification, was very democratic. A lot of people had a voice in its creation and its approval, and it gave rights to a lot more people than most countries in the world did at this point. 1787 was not exactly a time period of tremendous freedom around the world. There was absolute monarchies in numerous countries, czars in Russia, Louis XVI in France, a king and parliament in England. So this was not a time period where there was a lot of democratic competition. So the Constitution really does give us an edge in that regard. And so it's remarkable as a result of that. And it addresses the problems created, or the problems that the Articles of Confederation did not, which was really its goal to begin with, was to have a better form of government. And because the Constitution was amenable to change, that there was a provision in it that allowed for amendments, it also showed its flexibility. And so that's the government we end up with. So this whole process of revolution and country creation that takes place in Chapter 6 is remarkable, hugely significant, obviously, a key component, a chapter we'll come back to repeatedly. So hopefully that you go ahead through and read the chapter in more depth, and let me know if you have any questions. Take part in the discussion, reply to your people, take your time with the quiz, and like I said, we'll revisit these topics as they come up in later chapters. Thank you.